I strongly resonate with this theme and really think that being a catalyst is how folks in DEI in-house should think about their work and should encourage other teams to think about their work.
Hi, I'm Shannon Lucas. I'm one of the co-CEOs of Catalyst Constellations, which is dedicated to catalyzing innate change makers to accelerate positive change.
And I'm Justin Scott Campbell. I am a DEI consultant and leadership executive coach.
This is our podcast, Catalyzing a Culture of Inclusion, where we highlight catalysts who have taken the brave step of moving into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, leadership in large organizations.
We hope this mini-series is a space of learning, encouragement, and ultimately community and connection. If you're new to DEI and or the world of catalysts, we hope you'll enjoy. So today we have Jess Harvie here. Jess is a strategic and creative diversity, equity, and social impact leader. She has experience driving impact by bringing people together to solve real-world problems across big tech, startups, and nonprofits. Jess started her career as a lawyer in Australia, working across employment, environmental, refugee, and human rights law. She has 12 plus years of experience working in strategy and inclusion policy in large firms, nonprofits, and tech startups. Most recently at Snap, where Jess was responsible for a number of DEI firsts, including launching the company's first global self-ID survey, building Snap's DEI data reporting infrastructure, driving leadership accountability by embedding DEI into Snap's strategic plan, and leading Snap's product and content inclusion strategy. Jess is committed to changing the lens on inclusion in tech at a systemic level and was a key leader in the delivery of action to Catalyze Tech Report that brought 30 plus tech companies together to commit to a collective approach to change in the industry. Jess now consults with organizations to help make their workplaces more inclusive and their products more equitable. Jess, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin and Shannon. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, so as we start, we'd love to hear how you as a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging practitioner relate to the concept of being a catalyst.
Oh, I love this question so much. And honestly, it's made me really sit with this concept and realize just how much I do relate to being a catalyst, both personally and in my professional life. So I think I've always been a kind of naturally restless person. I get bored and frustrated pretty quickly with the status quo. And I'm always like kind of itching for that next kind of move or trying to agitate change in some way. And I think this is linked a little bit to the fact that I consider myself an optimist, and not in like a glass half full kind of way, but truly I believe that things can be better and we can create a better future, and things can always get better than they currently are. And I think in that sense, I can be an agitator. So asking questions, pushing boundaries. Like, I think sometimes people that work with me, maybe my husband would consider it complaining, but I actually think it's a way for us to get to the next step. And so for me, like I think agitation is part of that being a catalyst and getting us to that next place of change. But where like slow and steady kind of agitation doesn't work, I am all for big, bold actions to help us create circumstances where we can really shift the status quo. And that is both personally, I've made some big moves, like quitting my job and moving to a different country to try something new. And professionally, I think it is super important because as a DEI practitioner working inside an organization, there aren't many processes that you're trying to change that you actually own. So you really need to, like, for example, like recruiting, if you want to change that process, it's usually the recruiting team that kind of owns that process. So you can't just really get in there and make the change on your own. You need to be that catalyst. You need to help those teams and collaborate with those teams to create the circumstances that allow for that kind of systemic change to take place. And so I strongly resonate with this theme and really think that being a catalyst is how folks in DEI in-house should think about their work and should encourage other teams to think about their work.
Thank you so much for that. And the optimism is really, it's an interesting part that we don't talk a lot about in the book, but I think it is overall true for Catalyst. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of where that comes from for you, because a lot of times we're also like that, we have the frustration of it not working, but yet we can retain that optimism that like we're still going to push for the possibility.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have always kind of felt innately that things can be better, and I think that's on a social justice kind of scale, but also just personally, like I get to that point of discontent pretty quick, and I think the optimism is the idea that like seeing how far we've come in various spaces historically, like so many incredible kind of feats and innovations that like the human race has accomplished. It makes me confident that like if we put our minds to solve tough problems like systemic racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in companies, like we can do the hard thing. So it's really about how do we create that space and get the right people on board to make that happen.
Awesome. Thanks. So curious, what one or two skills do you think are necessary for sort of being a successful DEIB leader and catalyst?
It's such a great question. I think this will be obviously different for everyone depending on their strengths and their styles. I think for me, one of the biggest skills that I've been able to use not only as a DEI leader, but in my career prior to that is being able to build trust quickly. And part of that is like being able to communicate effectively, being like having a willingness and an openness to be vulnerable with other people so you can build those relationships. But I think for me, if people don't trust you, it's really unlikely that you're going to get those folks on board to make the change that you need to make together. So as I was saying before, I really do think collaboration is how you get a lot of this work done, particularly internally at companies. And to do that, you need people to be willing to kind of go along with your vision, and that is about creating trust. And I think on a one-to-one level, the work requires you where you'd like to be successful, to meet people where they are. And to be able to do that, it's about creating an environment where people feel safe asking questions that they might think are silly or obvious, but also like opening a door for people to reach out to you when something does go wrong, and making sure that you have the basics of that relationship so that DEI does have a seat at the table. Because I think that it often where there's a lack of trust, there's really kind of a failure to include experts where they need to be included. And for me, I think this has served well in a number of projects. One of the ones that I really wanted to talk about today, because it just aligns so well with the podcast and your work, is the Action to Catalyze Tech Report, which has Catalyze, cool. It has Catalyze in the title. And essentially, this was a report that was trying to get the entire tech industry to collaborate around collective DEI action so that we could 10x some of the DEI kind of results that we were looking for in tech. And it came from this idea that companies, particularly tech companies, have been trying to solve for DEI internally on their own, and really end up playing kind of a game of diversity musical chairs. So you'll have like Meta kind of hiring the same women software engineers from Google, who then hire, like, then Amazon poaches those folks, and like we're really not thinking about how the extreme kind of influence and resources of tech can solve this problem, or attempt to solve this problem, way earlier on at a much larger level. So one of the things that we had to do with this report was write the report. We were working with a bunch of academics, but we were also working with a a lot of tech companies trying to get them on board with this effort to sign up to a report before it was published. And we were doing it in a very short timeline. And so trust was key, because we needed folks to very quickly kind of align with the vision. We were dealing with a number of different stakeholders. And I think without that ability to kind of make those connections really quickly and communicate effectively as to what the vision was, we wouldn't have got the 30 plus companies that we did to sign on when we launched that report and commit to real accountability collectively in terms of DEI in the industry.
I love the ecosystem approach. I mean, I can feel when you talked about big, bold action, like you're at this massively impactful company, Snap, and at the same time, you're like, that's not big enough. We need to zoom out even bigger and look at the ecosystem approach. I'm wondering if you can talk about like how you went about building the trust, because I mean, pre-competitive associations like that are usually there's a big tension there.
Yeah, I think for a lot of DEI practitioners, and you might actually pick up on some of these themes talking to some other folks on the podcast, but we innately understand the larger problems that we're trying to solve, but positioned in companies are given a very specific mandate, sometimes doesn't extend to solving some of those larger systemic problems that we'd like to. And I think this was an invitation to a lot of folks to actually step into that space that they've wanted to for a while. And so that, in that sense, we were working with a friendly audience, I would say.
Right.
But I do think specifically, like, being able to communicate this vision in a really effective way and also make folks see what it would mean for them and their companies was important. And so we had to figure that out pretty quick. And we learned along the way, like we had a lot of conversations with people that were not interested, either because we didn't have a clear enough vision, it didn't make sense to them, or maybe it really wasn't part of their mandate to think more broadly in terms of the ecosystem. And learned a lot through that process about how to better kind of connect with folks, build trust earlier before having those initial conversations, etc.
Yeah, I think that point is really important, the being able to help them see the what's in it for me, even if you're working on the same stuff, like it comes from the organizational team down to even the individual. All right, so we've got trust, and sort of underneath that is collab and great storytelling. Is there another skill?
Yeah, I think it's going to sound a bit broad, but I think it can be applied broadly, and that's curiosity. So I really think that DEI, personally, and others may not agree, but DEI is an approach, not necessarily an answer, right? So there's no way that one person will be able to be an expert of every single identity or community group. But there are some principles that you can apply. And one of those, I think, is actually getting curious and staying curious about people's experiences, but also internally, like your cross-functional partners' business objectives. Like, how do we make DEI part of the fabric of the company or how we do business? And part of that is actually like figuring out what matters to people, whether on a business level or the experience of, let's say, Hispanic female engineers in a particular organization. Like, really diving deep is something that's really important.
It's so true. And it's funny because we have classes that, help catalysts perfect their change-making skills, minimizing resistance, which then obviously minimizes their own burnout, but it also accelerates change. And we have like a pathway to change, and we intentionally designed it as a candy land or chutes and ladders, because you'll get part of the way through the thing and then you'll hit this resistance, and unintentional, unself-aware catalysts will just try and barrel through because they're so convinced of their own thing. And if you can teach them one thing, it's curiosity. And it's funny because people are like, well, aren't catalysts curious by nature? You're always exploring and connecting dots. And it's like, but this is when the curiosity matters. It's like, why am I hitting this resistance right now? What are the blockers? What am I not seeing? What are their wins? All of that stuff. I just love the clarity of that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And if I can add to that, Shannon,
Of
I
course.
think I think being curious on its own is actually like, if you are naturally inclined, it's a pretty easy thing to do. But I think sometimes in practice, it's a little bit harder, particularly coming in. A lot of DEI professionals are usually from an underrepresented group or multiple underrepresented groups, and usually being asked to walk into a room and be experts on a particular thing. I think then it's sometimes really uncomfortable to say, actually, I don't have the answer here, or can I ask a few questions to kind of understand what is actually going on here, because sometimes you want that perceived authority as you enter a space, and sometimes asking questions can potentially seem like it's undermining that expertise or that authority. But if you can, and I struggled with that for a long time. Like I always felt like I needed to have all the answers as soon as I was in the room.
No, you have to, right? As the woman or the person of color in the room, you've been taught your whole life the only way that people listen to you is if you have deep domain expertise, and the unlearning of that is the superpower. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it is definitely a learning process, but I think if you can get there and you're in a space where you can really go deep and like get people to open up and just like turn like, usually people will come to you, I think, internally with a very specific DEI question that they just want that very specific answer to, like, is this racist or not? And it's really like, it's easy to fall within that framework that they kind of put you in and just be like, yes, no, like for these reasons. But I think if you can like take a step back and be like, so what are we actually trying to achieve here? Let's figure out the most inclusive way to do this together. It just opens that door for collaboration and a better long-term kind of inclusive outcome.
Yeah, and I think there's so much there around the idea of being curious, and then also of vulnerability, right? And like, I'm curious, as you look at building trust, do you have any stories or examples of the ways in which you kind of create spaces where people feel safe to be vulnerable, or how would a leader go about doing that in a work environment?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, Justin. I think vulnerability is, again, a really hard thing to practice in a professional setting where potentially you have an identity that isn't part of the majority, or you don't look like the other people in the room. I have personally used like one-on-one conversations and relationships building. I found that a lot easier than like going into a room like of maybe 5 or 6 execs and like sharing a story about myself that maybe makes me really uncomfortable and potentially doesn't create the right atmosphere to kind of build that trust with the back and forth. And so I've leveraged one-on-one relationships in a really strong way. It's one of the things I like to do ahead of any kind of large group meeting, is connect with those folks and try and build that trust one-on-one. So sharing, I'm trying to think of a very particular story that I could share about being vulnerable. But I think even kind of saying the stuff that I'm saying to you both today about like, hey, I don't always know all the answers. Like, this is a thing we can do together, is actually really it disarms people a little bit. And I think they expect, in some ways, DEI to be like compliance police in a way, and where you can kind of show that you're there to help them and work together, by kind of humanizing yourself and your experience, and doing the same for them. I think it really opens the door for that collaboration further down the track.
Yeah, and that's I think so much of that vulnerability, like you said, is in the I don't know, or I'm figuring this out too, and giving people the space to not know. I really want to pull out what you said about the one-on-ones, because I think that does require a lot of intentionality and time and investment in time. But what I hear you saying is that investment of time pays dividends down the road in building trust. And so it's worth it to have those one-on-one conversations, and then in those to be intentional about hey, I don't have all the answers and neither do you, but together, we can figure some stuff out. So I think that's a beautiful way to think about it. So as you are, in your own space of being a Catalyst leader, what are some of the biggest challenges that you are kind of looking at in the future?
I think at this current time, one of the biggest challenges is loss of momentum, and perceived lack of commitment from companies, whether it be like because of the recent like layoffs in the tech company the tech industry, where we've seen like underrepresented groups impacted more, DEI teams impacted. I think we had, following George Floyd's murder, there was obviously a real shift in how folks were prioritizing DEI, and that was something that a lot of DEI teams were able to capitalize on in terms of like making swift change that otherwise may have taken 5 to 10 years longer. But I think right now we're at a point where businesses really need to kind of look inside themselves and be like, are we really committed to all the things we said we were committed to in 2020? And how do we back that up with the right resources, expertise, and commitment to our employees from underrepresented groups? I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I'm kind of grappling with at the moment. And then more personally, I think it's figuring out how to stay in the fight. I think a lot of this work, as you would know, being in the space, but also like talking to a number of DEI practitioners, it's tough. It can be really tough. And I've seen a number of colleagues like really struggle with the burnout and not get the support that they need, or even the understanding. I think a lot of folks that aren't in the space look at DEI, look at a DEI role in a company and think, wow, that's like the dream. What a cool job. And it is in so many ways. I feel very privileged to be able to do the work in the spaces that I've been able to do it in. But I also think that a lot of people don't see the emotional labor that goes on behind like that work, and how those one-on-ones, each of them takes a little bit from you that maybe you weren't expecting. Some of them give tons of energy to you as well, and those are the great ones. But it really is, it's really a battle to I think stay in the fight, knowing that it is such a long game. And so that's something that I've kind of been grappling with personally. Like, how do I make sure that I set boundaries, take time to kind of rest and rejuvenate? Rest is resistance in this work. You don't want all these great people dropping out because they're burnt out and don't have the support that they need.
Yeah, and I hear kind of some notes around loneliness, and I'm curious too, like how community plays a role in that kind of rest and wellness and recharging. And maybe for you personally, how you've seen having peers in this work come alongside you, how that has supported you in your own work.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most extraordinary kind of outcomes, I think, have been in my work personally has been created only with the support of other people and the collaboration with other people. And I am extremely grateful that I've had very like competent but also like supportive colleagues in my various roles, whether it's on the DEI team or even outside the organization or elsewhere in the organization, that have kind of checked in when they've seen that things might not be okay, offered to take on some work so that someone else can kind of take a break for a while. Like that's also important, especially when we're all kind of feeling the same thing. I just think the camaraderie in this work is really powerful and necessary. And I do think there's another side of it where it can be competitive. And I think that is problematic for the final kind of the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And so the more that we can encourage collaboration and create community, which is something that you all are doing here, and we fully appreciate that. I think that's very, very important for us to do this collective work.
Can you say more about the competitive? No one's brought that up before, and it's such an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, I've only been thinking about this like in depth recently, so it might not be fully formed, but I think that the way that and this is particularly to the tech industry, so it might be different in other industries. The way that we think about DEI externally is usually with these like metrics, numbers, like how many women do we have in this organization? How many women in leadership? How many people of color, etc. And it's this really like almost feels like a zero-sum game in some respects, which I don't believe is the essence of the work or what we're actually trying to get to. And I think though that kind of reporting that is encouraged, or I don't know if it's encouraged, but it's definitely become the norm. I think that does create some competitiveness between companies, between DEI leaders who are potentially leading those efforts, and which is why I think the work that we did on Action to Catalyze Tech was really important, because it was about like, actually we need to be doing this together, and it's very cool that we can learn from the cool stuff that you've been doing there, but you know, because you guys did it first, are we allowed to say it in our diversity annual report? Like I think there's still a way that we can shift the narrative around the work and what success looks like, company to company, that would help us be more collaborative.
Yeah, and I think that as you're saying that, I'm also thinking about when we talk sometimes about the business case for diversity. One of the things we say is that you're competing for diverse talent. And so I think maybe one of the unexpected results of that is companies become competitive about the performance of this work for their potential new employees. And so it becomes a kind of like, we want to be the best and attract the best. So that makes sense as well.
Yeah, totally. And I'm super curious. So we'll put a link if we can. Is the report public? We'll put a link in the show notes to it, because I imagine like a great ecosystem thing would be like, okay, here's where we see the numbers now. Let's commit to in 10 years having worked on the pipeline issues so that we've tripled that number for all of us, something on that sort of systems level.
Exactly.
All right, so we get to move to the other fun part, the rapid fire. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Awesome. One thing that you do to be ready for a big meeting.
So if it's in person, slightly embarrassed to say it, but not really, like power poses or like pump up music before going into a room.
Nice.
And in this Zoom world that we're living in, checking out your lighting and figuring out your background before you join the meeting, I think is actually really important.
I love that one. Yeah. Super specific in the stuff that we sometimes just like, we come in hot and we don't get ready for it. Totally. Favorite way to spend a free day?
Oh gosh, I love free days. Honestly.
Do you get many, Jess?
I mean, in my new role, which is working for myself, I do actually.
Awesome. You're like, that's the point.
Exactly.
That's how you married yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So got to get outdoors in some way. Like if maybe take my dog to the dog beach. He just loves that. And it just makes me so happy to see him like frolicking in the water. And then going to my favorite cafe with the perfect coffee and like whatever book I'm reading at the time, or with my laptop and just kind of like writing. But I could sit in a cafe with good coffee all day. What
book are you currently reading?
So I'm actually in between books, but I'm about to start this book called Hatching, which is about it's about the fertility system in the US and how I mean, this is a reduction, but to how kind of sexist it is.
Curious. Awesome. Favorite famous catalyst, alive or dead, and why?
So Jacinda Ardern came to mind. I mean, there are so many, but she, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, just did some epic things policy-wise, like introducing gun restrictions like immediately after a big event. Like really, she moves quickly, but also leading by example. And to be honest, I think one of her biggest acts of resistance was actually stepping down and like showing the world that, hey, actually authentic and empathetic leadership is really hard when done properly. And if you want me to kind of continue to impact the world on a long-term basis, I got to take a beat. And I really, really respect her for the work that she did in that role, but also what she continues to do post.
Yeah. And I love that final point because she really did model it so well, just so authentic, and the toll that can take. I love that. All right. Do you have a call of action for our listeners that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think so. If you're working in DEI, the biggest kind of call to action is like rest, like rejuvenate, and then get back into the fight after you've put your own oxygen mask on. Like we need you in the fight, but we also know it's really hard. So do what you need for you to make sure that you can come back. And then going back to one of my other themes, just generally, I think it's like get curious and stay curious. I think curiosity is one of the biggest drivers of empathy. And I think if we were better able to scale empathy, a lot of our DEI challenges would become moot. And I'm really encourage folks to just get curious with everything that's happening around them. And also, if you do need a DEI consultant, I am now on the market, here to support your organization, startups, big tech, nonprofits with all your DEI kind of challenges and needs. So yeah.
Awesome. We'll put a link in the show notes so that they can contact you and find out more about your services.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming to the podcast today, Jessica. We're excited to see the next steps and to see where you end up in working and moving and bringing all this work to companies. And again, I'm going to reiterate what you just said, Jess. Like if you resonate with what Jess was sharing today, please bring her to your organization and check out her work. And so thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about how to accelerate positive change, go to our website at catalystconstellations.com.
And be sure to check out our book, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out. If you have other catalysts in your life, hit the share button and send a link their way. Thanks again.